Let your mind drift far back in time, to an age when the world felt larger than imagination, when entire civilizations lived unaware of each other, separated not by oceans or borders but by silence and distance. In that quiet space before empires began to truly speak to one another, a single idea started to glow like a faint light in the dark. A road. A pathway. A connection waiting to be discovered. And the story of that connection begins with a young empire searching for something it could not yet name. In the eastern heart of Asia, the Han dynasty was rising, powerful yet threatened on all sides by swift riders of the steppe. Night after night, border towns watched the horizon in fear, knowing the thunder of hooves could appear without warning. These raiders were fierce, quick, and hard to understand, and for years China felt as though it was fighting shadows. But deep inside the walls of the imperial court, a thought began to take shape. Perhaps survival would not come from more battles, but from looking beyond the familiar edges of the world. It was in this moment of uncertainty that an imperial attendant named Zhang Qian was summoned. He was not a warrior, not a general, not someone accustomed to commanding armies. He was simply someone who listened more than he spoke and who seemed willing to walk into the unknown if asked. And that is exactly what Emperor Wu demanded of him. Find new allies, the emperor said. Find people who can help us stand against the threats pressing on our borders. Find answers somewhere beyond the mountains. It was a mission that would change history, though none of them yet understood how. Zhang Qian set out with a small group, carrying gifts, letters, and hope. The land beyond China was unfamiliar, shaped by rugged valleys, endless dunes, and winds that seemed to whisper warnings. Yet he pushed onward. Day blended into day, and the silence of the wild world began to stretch so far that it almost swallowed the sound of footsteps. But just as he felt he might be learning how to navigate this vastness, he and his companions were captured by the very people they hoped to outmaneuver. The nomadic riders did not kill him. They watched him, questioned him, and slowly allowed him small freedoms, believing he would eventually accept his fate. But in the stillness of captivity, Zhang Qian's spirit sharpened. He observed their customs, their routes, their strengths. Each season that passed gave him more knowledge, more understanding, more certainty that the world outside China was connected in ways no one back home imagined. He spent years like this, years that would have broken most people. Yet he carried the mission inside him like a small flame, refusing to let it die. When he finally escaped, slipping away under the cover of chaos, he traveled deeper west than any Chinese envoy before him. The lands he crossed revealed a different rhythm of life, shaped by rivers, orchards, and cities that seemed to rise from the desert like mirages. The people he met wore unfamiliar clothing, spoke unfamiliar languages, and traded goods he had never seen. And yet, scattered among these far-off markets, he saw something unmistakably familiar: silk. Silk from China, somehow carried across impossible distances. Every time he saw it, he wondered about the invisible lines connecting people who had never met. Who carried the silk? Who bought it? How many hands did it pass through? Could these hidden paths become bridges instead of mysteries? That question stayed with him, echoing softly as he traveled, as though urging him to look closer. And the more he looked, the more he realized that his journey had grown far larger than the mission he'd started with. It was no longer about alliances. It was about discovering a world of exchange waiting to be understood. After more trials, more detours, and more brushes with danger, he returned home. Years had passed. His hair was longer, his face marked by sun and hardship. Many believed he was dead. Yet there he stood, ready to speak of the vast world beyond the empire. When he shared stories of horses stronger than any in China, cities painted with bright markets, and networks of trade stretching farther than anyone imagined, he reshaped the thinking of the imperial court. Suddenly the world did not feel like a series of isolated pockets, but like a chain of possibilities stretching from one horizon to the other. The emperor listened, fascinated. And from this moment, a new vision was born. China would not hide behind its borders. It would reach outward. It would share its creations and learn from the creations of others. It would let movement, rather than fear, define its place in the world. And so caravans began to form, carrying silk, spices, lacquerware, musicians, storytellers, and ideas. They walked into lands once seen as dangerous, guided now by curiosity instead of dread. But the beginning of this grand connection was still fragile. Each caravan faced deserts where footsteps vanished behind them, where wind erased all direction, and where a single storm could swallow a traveler whole. Crossing these spaces required patience, courage, and faith in a destination they had only heard about in stories. Yet they continued, step by step, because each traveler sensed something larger than themselves at work, something that whispered that the world was beginning to breathe as one. As these early explorers moved forward, small exchanges became relationships, and relationships became routes. What began as a political mission slowly transformed into the first threads of a global tapestry. And though these threads were delicate, they held surprising strength. They carried more than goods. They carried dreams, beliefs, colors, rituals, and questions that had waited centuries to be shared. Caravans would pause at night under skies so wide that even silence felt endless. Traders would sit near dim fires and speak in different tongues, yet somehow understand one another through gestures and warmth. Ideas drifted in the air, traveling faster than the camels that carried the goods. And in these quiet moments, the Silk Road was not just a path. It was a heartbeat. And this is only where the story begins, with the first spark of curiosity that dared to link worlds once destined to remain strangers. Night after night, the caravans pressed deeper into unfamiliar lands, guided only by the stars and the memory of those who had walked before them. The world stretched out in ways that felt endless. Mountains rose like dark silhouettes against the horizon, deserts shimmered with heat like living oceans, and valleys revealed pockets of life where strangers greeted travelers not with suspicion, but with cautious curiosity. Each new place added a new layer to the growing rhythm of exchange, as if the earth itself was slowly opening its doors. Along these paths, traders learned that survival depended not on strength, but on trust. They learned to share water with strangers, to respect local rules, and to listen carefully when elders spoke of hidden dangers, sandstorms that arrived without warning, wells that ran dry, cliffs that crumbled under careless feet. And they learned that every city, no matter how small, held a story worth remembering. One city became known for its musicians who played stringed instruments that sounded like drifting wind. Another became known for its pottery, painted with swirling designs that seemed to dance under the sun. And another for its storytellers, who could turn even the simplest event into a tale that lingered long after travelers had left. But these early connections were fragile. Every step tested the courage of those willing to make the journey. Traders faced bandits who studied the shadows, waiting for caravans to pass. They faced harsh winters when wind carried ice that cut like blades. They faced deep loneliness, sometimes traveling for weeks without seeing a single other soul. Yet they continued, driven by something bigger than profit, a hunger to understand the strange and magnificent world unfolding before them. As time passed, the Silk Road began to take shape not as one long path, but as a web of routes. Some wound through fertile valleys, others skirted the edges of deserts, and still others climbed steep mountain passes where air thinned and cold settled into bones. Travelers learned to choose their paths wisely because each route offered different challenges. Some were faster but exposed. Others were safer but painfully slow. Choosing wrong could mean losing cargo, companions, or even the will to go on. Still, movement increased. Caravans grew larger. Cities grew wealthier. Marketplaces buzzed with voices speaking in dozens of languages. And one truth became impossible to ignore: silk was at the heart of everything. People treated it not as fabric but as treasure. It shimmered in torchlight, soft yet strong, delicate yet enduring. To some, silk was a symbol of elegance. To others, it was a symbol of mystical power. And for countless merchants, it was the promise of opportunity. In the West, far beyond the lands most travelers knew, whispers began to spread of a mighty empire whose citizens wore garments so finely woven they seemed almost unreal. Roman nobles, hearing of silk's beauty, demanded more of it. They did not know where it came from or who made it, but they felt drawn to it as though it carried the essence of the distant East. And so silver began to flow through the routes, a river of wealth traveling in the opposite direction of the shimmering fabric that inspired so much awe. Meanwhile, far to the east, China watched as its influence slowly extended across borders. Not through war, not through conquest, but through the gentle pull of desire. When people wanted silk, they also wanted the things that came with it: Chinese art, Chinese stories, Chinese inventions. The flow of goods became the flow of ideas. And little by little, cultures that had once been separated by vast silence now brushed against one another like threads in a tapestry. But even as the world grew closer, danger never vanished. The deserts remained unforgiving. The steppes remained unpredictable. And the mountains remained indifferent to the hopes of travelers. Entire caravans sometimes disappeared without a trace, swallowed by shifting sands or lost in storms that wiped away all sense of direction. These tragedies became quiet reminders that the Silk Road was not merely a path of prosperity. It was also a path of risk, shaped equally by wonder and fear. There were nights when merchants camped near quiet oases where palm trees swayed gently, their reflections stretching across still pools of water. In those moments, the world felt peaceful. Yet even then, someone always kept watch, listening for distant footsteps or the soft crack of twigs that might signal strangers drawing near. The line between friend and foe could be impossibly thin, and every traveler learned to evaluate trust with cautious eyes. Still, there was something soothing about the rhythm of the journey. The slow steps of camels. The steady whisper of cloth shifting under warm breezes. The flicker of lanterns painting golden patterns across the sand. Travelers found comfort in these simple things, knowing they shared the experience with countless others whose footprints vanished long ago. Every journey felt personal, yet also part of something vast and ancient. As the Silk Road expanded, it also changed the people who lived along it. Farmers became merchants. Merchants became diplomats. Diplomats became storytellers who brought news of distant lands back to their communities. And rulers began to see the value not only in guarding these routes, but in nurturing them. They built caravanserais where travelers could rest safely. They enforced rules to reduce theft. They encouraged trade by lowering taxes and offering protection in exchange for loyalty. Slowly, the Silk Road became not merely a path, but the lifeline of countless societies. In Central Asia, entire cultures emerged as bridges between worlds. The people there learned to speak multiple languages, understand multiple traditions, and read the moods of travelers better than they could read the stars. They laughed with Chinese merchants, debated philosophy with Indian monks, bargained fiercely with Persian traders, and welcomed wanderers from the Mediterranean with food and stories. Their lands became the crossroads of humanity, places where anyone could find a familiar voice or a new friend. As cultural exchange deepened, ideas began to travel faster than goods. Mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy flowed across continents, reshaping how people understood life. A doctor in Persia might use techniques developed in China. A scholar in India might debate ideas that originated in the Mediterranean. A poet in Central Asia might write verses inspired by stories from the Far East. The world, once divided into countless separate worlds, now felt like a single vast conversation. And yet, despite all this growth, the Silk Road still felt young, still in the early chapters of its long story. The connections it created were delicate threads, vulnerable to the winds of change, to wars, to greed, to ambition. But the people walking its paths carried something powerful within them, a belief that distance could be crossed, that strangers could trade peacefully, that ideas could bind humanity as strongly as walls once divided it. Each caravan that moved forward carried that belief with it, even if no one spoke it aloud. And with every mile they traveled, the world drew just a little bit closer together. As the years passed, the Silk Road grew into something far greater than anyone could have imagined. Travelers who began their journeys with simple goals, selling goods, seeking fortune, visiting distant relatives, found themselves stepping into a world that felt alive with movement. Every crossing of a mountain pass revealed new landscapes, new faces, and new stories. And with each encounter, people carried home small fragments of cultures they had never known existed. This constant exchange created a quiet transformation, one that spread slowly and gently across entire civilizations. In the bustling oasis towns, music drifted into the night air from instruments shaped by different hands and different histories. Some melodies carried the softness of Eastern flutes, while others echoed with the deep resonance of Western drums. Listeners, weary from travel, found themselves mesmerized by sounds that blended together like languages learning to speak to one another. There were dances influenced by regions hundreds of miles apart, recipes that combined spices from multiple climates, and garments stitched with patterns that travelers recognized from lands far beyond the horizon. But the Silk Road was not just a path of beauty and harmony. It was also a path shaped by ambition. Rulers across continents began to see how trade brought wealth and influence. They realized that whoever controlled key sections of the route could shape the flow of goods and ideas. And so new alliances were formed, and old rivalries deepened. Kingdoms fortified their borders, sent diplomats to negotiate treaties, and sometimes engaged in fierce battles for control of mountain passes or river crossings that served as gateways between worlds. Despite these conflicts, the Silk Road never truly closed for long. Even during times of war, when soldiers patrolled the roads and fear settled over cities, merchants found ways to continue moving. Some traveled in larger groups for safety. Others took alternative paths that twisted through narrow valleys or skirted along the edges of dangerous territories. They understood that the road was bigger than any single kingdom or ruler. It was a lifeline, and to abandon it would mean losing a vital connection to the rest of humanity. As trade intensified, new centers of learning began to rise along the route. Scholars gathered in bustling cities to exchange books, debate philosophy, and teach foreign students who had traveled great distances. Libraries expanded as knowledge from Greece, India, Persia, and China mingled on shared shelves. Travelers carried not only goods, but manuscripts, carefully rolled scrolls and bound volumes containing stories, mathematical theories, medical texts, and astronomical observations. These writings traveled farther than their creators could have ever dreamed. In these centers of learning, ideas began to merge. A mathematician who grew up among the plains of Central Asia learned geometry from Greek texts and refined his techniques through Indian numerals. A healer in a river town discovered new methods of surgery based on Chinese acupuncture and Persian herbal medicine. A philosopher from a distant kingdom debated moral teachings that blended influences from multiple civilizations. In these exchanges, the world became richer, smarter, and more connected, not through conquest but through curiosity. Meanwhile, spiritual beliefs also began to travel. Monks walked with caravans, carrying teachings that inspired peace and reflection. Some spread the messages of compassion and balance, while others brought stories of gods, heroes, and ancient creation myths. Shrines and sacred statues appeared in places far from their origins, becoming symbols of openness and shared understanding. Travelers often paused at these spiritual sites, lighting candles or placing small offerings as a way of honoring the unseen forces that guided their journeys. One of the most remarkable transformations occurred when small monasteries emerged along the most dangerous stretches of the desert. Built by devoted communities, these sanctuaries offered shelter to anyone, merchants, pilgrims, wanderers, or lost souls seeking a moment of rest. Inside their walls, silence wrapped around visitors like a warm blanket. The monks tended to the weary, offered food and water, and provided comfort without expecting anything in return. Those who left these sanctuaries often carried with them a deeper sense of unity, believing that kindness could exist even in the harshest places. Yet for all its wonders, the Silk Road remained unpredictable. Nature itself continued to shape its rhythm. A single sandstorm could erase the tracks of entire caravans, leaving travelers with nothing but instinct to guide them. Rivers shifted course, forcing merchants to find new crossings. Earthquakes transformed landscapes, closing old routes and opening new ones. Even the most experienced guides sometimes felt humbled by the vastness of the world they navigated. In winter, travelers wrapped themselves in layers of warm fabric, their breath rising in pale clouds as they crossed icy plains. In summer, they shielded their eyes from glaring sunlight and wrapped cloth over their faces to keep sand from filling their lungs. They learned to read the sky, to recognize the patterns of clouds that hinted at storms, and to sense the subtle temperature shifts that signaled upcoming changes in weather. Every journey taught them new skills, new ways to survive, new stories to pass down. And still, despite all hardships, the allure of the road persisted. Travelers often found themselves thinking about the friends they met along the way. There was the cheerful trader who sold spices with a laugh that echoed through market stalls, the quiet scholar who carried books wrapped in cloth to protect them from the sun, the young musician who played haunting tunes under moonlit skies, the elder with deep wrinkles who shared wisdom gained from a lifetime of journeys. Each person left an imprint, a memory woven into the traveler's heart, reminding them that the Silk Road was not just a path of trade but a path of human connection. Even rulers who rarely traveled felt the road's impact. They decorated their palaces with foreign art, wore garments inspired by distant styles, and filled banquet halls with dishes flavored by spices brought from thousands of miles away. Envoys spoke of distant courts, describing customs that were strange yet fascinating. As these rulers looked over maps and reports, they began to feel less isolated, recognizing that the world was far larger and more intertwined than they once believed. But for the ordinary traveler, the road held a more personal meaning. It was a place of transformation, where mountains tested their courage, deserts tested their patience, and strangers tested their kindness. Those who walked its length often felt that they had left behind their old selves and discovered something new within. The Silk Road became a teacher, revealing that the world was full of surprising beauty, unpredictable danger, and endless possibility. And as all these journeys unfolded, one quiet truth grew stronger with each passing generation. Even the smallest exchange, a story, a handshake, a piece of cloth, a shared meal, could ripple outward, carrying warmth and understanding across continents. The Silk Road was no longer just a route. It was a living connection, a timeless reminder that humanity becomes stronger when it dares to reach beyond its boundaries. As the Silk Road matured, it began to feel less like a distant thread and more like a pulse running through the heart of continents. Generations were born into a world where foreign travelers were no longer curiosities but familiar sights along the horizon. Children grew up listening to tales carried from distant lands, stories that blended adventure with wisdom, hardship with wonder. These stories shaped their dreams, inspiring them to imagine lives larger than the boundaries of their hometowns. In the great cities that thrived along the road, morning markets stirred to life with the first light of dawn. Merchants lifted heavy wooden shutters, releasing the scents of spices that drifted into the air like invisible trails of comfort. Camels groaned as they rose from resting places, ready to continue their journeys. Blacksmiths hammered metal, potters spun clay, and weavers threaded bright colors into fabrics that travelers would soon carry to far-off places. Every sound blended into a kind of morning symphony, steady and timeless. Throughout these lively scenes, people from different worlds mingled effortlessly. A merchant from China might share tea with a Persian traveler. A scholar from India might engage in quiet conversation with a philosopher from Greece. A nomadic herder might trade wool with a craftsman who lived among city walls. What made these interactions remarkable was not their rarity but their growing normality. The Silk Road taught people to expand their sense of belonging, to understand that the world was filled with countless voices worth hearing. Yet even as this harmony flourished, the road carried shadows as well. Ambitious rulers recognized the immense power flowing through its arteries. Some sought to control key segments, sending armies to claim strategic passes or levy heavy taxes. Others attempted to manipulate markets by restricting resources or monopolizing trade. And there were always those who watched caravans from a distance, calculating how best to seize their treasures. The Silk Road demanded constant vigilance, for every blessing it offered came paired with risks. Still, the movement of people and ideas refused to stop. Even during tumultuous times, travelers found hope in moments of quiet humanity. A caravan rescued from a storm by a village that had little to spare. A wounded merchant helped by strangers who expected no reward. A young guide who risked his life to lead travelers safely across treacherous cliffs. These small acts of kindness became the invisible threads holding the road together, reminding everyone that cooperation mattered as much as commerce. In some regions, entire communities became known for their hospitality. Travelers approaching these places felt their worries ease as they recognized familiar markers: lanterns hanging from archways, rows of shade trees planted by past generations, and the welcoming sound of voices carried on the evening wind. These communities understood the value of the road. It not only brought wealth but wove them into a larger story. They embraced their role as caretakers of travelers, offering water, shelter, and calm to those arriving weary from the journey. As centuries passed, the road carried inventions that reshaped everyday life. Paper traveled westward, revolutionizing communication and education. Techniques for making glassware traveled eastward, illuminating new possibilities in art and science. Mathematical concepts, medical knowledge, and astronomical observations spread across the route, creating a shared intellectual foundation for people separated by enormous distances. Each new idea that passed along the road strengthened its role as a bridge of understanding. And through all this movement, religions continued to travel with steady determination. Pilgrims walked side by side with merchants, carrying spiritual teachings tucked safely among their belongings. Temples, shrines, and monasteries rose along the route, offering guidance to those who sought answers beyond the physical world. These sacred spaces encouraged reflection, reminding travelers that the journey inward was just as meaningful as the journey across continents. In the glow of lanterns, monks taught meditation to strangers who would later carry those teachings to their distant homes. Even when empires rose and fell, the Silk Road endured. New leaders inherited the dreams of those who came before them. They minted coins with symbols meant to show unity, built strong roads to support the weight of commerce, and sent envoys across borders to reaffirm alliances. They understood that protecting the Silk Road meant protecting the flow of life, its goods, its ideas, its people, and its spirit. But the passage of time also brought subtle changes. Seafaring technology improved. Ships grew stronger, faster, and capable of carrying more cargo across vast oceans. Suddenly, routes that once required months of travel by land could be completed more quickly by sea. Port cities started to glow with opportunity, drawing merchants who once depended solely on the overland passage. Slowly, the Silk Road began to share its role as the world's connector with new maritime pathways. This shift did not erase the road's importance, but it softened its dominance. Some caravan routes quieted. Certain cities lost their bustling crowds. Inns that once overflowed with travelers saw fewer footprints in the dust. But even as the road changed, it continued to hold a powerful presence in the memories of those who had walked it. To them, the Silk Road was more than a means of trade. It was a living map of human courage and imagination. For many, the road also represented transformation. A young trader who left home with a small bundle of goods might return years later with a deeper understanding of the world. A scholar who set out seeking rare texts might return with new philosophies that reshaped how entire communities viewed life. A musician who carried only an instrument might return with new melodies woven from distant inspirations. The Silk Road changed people, and through them, it continued changing civilizations. Its legacy endured in languages enriched by borrowed words, cuisines shaped by shared spices, art influenced by foreign motifs, and countless traditions that blended elements from far-reaching cultures. Even in quiet corners of the world, where ancient caravans once passed under star-filled skies, echoes of the Silk Road remain in the way people dress, speak, pray, and dream. And although empires faded and routes shifted, the spirit of the Silk Road never disappeared. It lives wherever people choose curiosity over fear, connection over isolation, and understanding over division. It survives in every handshake across a cultural boundary, in every exchange of wisdom between strangers, in every journey that begins with a single brave step into the unknown. For the Silk Road was never just a place on a map. It was a testament to what humanity becomes when it moves, listens, shares, and grows. A reminder that even in a vast world, the paths we create between each other are what truly shape our future.